you will hopefully take some good tidbits away today. I'm going to kick us off, and to do that, I want to first make some quick introductions so that you know who's up here on stage. I'm Shawn Ivey. I run our Google Workplace Productivity practice at Accenture, and is obviously focused on G Suite. And I am here with three amazing colleagues who you'll hear from the majority of the session today. I think combined 22 plus years experience doing G Suite implementations for large organizations. So some fantastic experience both on the technology side but also on the change management side, which of course is very, very important in this space. So glad to have the team here with me. To keep things on a light note, I'm sure everyone has had the pleasure of working in a large, complex project at one point or another. So you can appreciate lots of moving pieces, lots of risk, and of course, none of us want to be that guy that just hopped on the scooter there and fell into the big hole in the middle of the street. Not quite sure where that's at, but I don't want to go there. What we do, of course, want, understanding there's still lots of moving parts, understanding there's still lots of complexity, we want to have enough preparation and some good information that allows us to navigate and ideally avoid major injury, which you can see is the case here. So, what we're going to talk through today, and I'll get a little bit to the kind of the context of this, but what we're going to talk to today is to share with you, hopefully some experience, some feedback, some success factors, as the title of the session would indicate, based on our experience implementing G Suite for large organizations. Now, I do want to highlight that we're Accenture. We like to work with large enterprises, as I think most people probably appreciate. And certainly for G Suite moving into the large enterprise space, it's an interesting sort of transition, right? And part of why we wanted to do this session was to highlight the fact that in the large enterprise space, obviously there can often be different dynamics, right, that you may want to consider both from an organizational perspective but also from a technology perspective. Certainly it's been our experience that this is, again, in the large enterprise, this is more than just bringing in some new tools, implementing the tools, moving on to the next project. This is often part of a much broader initiative around workforce transformation in these companies, right? So kudos to those kind of early pioneers, those early adopters, who are not just, again, implementing some new technology, they're fundamentally trying to change, in many instances, the way work gets done, right? It's a major culture change throughout the organization. So I'm going to end my brief introduction here and hand it over to Keith in a second, but wanted to just give a shout out to those who have kind of paved the way for many of the rest of us as we're now seeing greater adoption of G Suite in the enterprise. And we're going to spend some time with you in fairly rapid fire motion. We've got a lot of content, so we won't be able to go particularly deep on anything in particular, and we want to get across as many of these key concepts as we can. So it'll be fairly rapid fire, but we'll be around both after the session and throughout the week. Accenture, of course, has a booth there in the expo hall, so we would welcome questions after the session. Come find us during the week. We'd love to talk to you some more. So with that, I will hand it over to Keith.
Thanks, Chet. All right, so in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead and get started here. Good to be with you guys. So what we have here is a typical G Suite deployment, including all of the relevant work streams. So today we're going to focus on technology, and we're also going to talk about user adoption and managing change. So at the top there, you'll see Google's recommended three-phase approach, which is going to include core IT, early adopters, and global go-live, and it lasts about 90 days typically. So as we've done these deployments over the years, what we've come to realize is that even though all of your users are successfully migrated to G Suite, there are still other deployment activities that need to be done, right? So we've kind of coined those as post-deployment activities. And what we've done is we've actually started to modify our methodology to include these post-go-live activities. Some of them may include things such as end-user file migration from a network file share over to Google Drive, migrating applications that have integration or dependencies on the Microsoft Office suite. Also looking at your business processes and workflows and understanding if we can solution them either in G Suite or GCP. So there are some current programs that provide guidance around some of these topics, such as Google's Next Mile program, as well as business transformation workshops. So it's our recommendation to actually break these activities away from your standard deployment methodology timeline to avoid project delays, as well as so your project key stakeholders can visualize, create, and meet short-term milestones, such as migrating your users to G Suite, as well as long-term integration milestones. So here are some topics within the actual technology workstream. A lot of them we're going to cover today. If you engage a partner such as Accenture, it is their responsibility to actually take you through a deep dive of all of these projects in what we call a DPW, which is a deployment workshop, or a TKO, which is a technical kickoff. So during these sessions, it helps move things along if you do your own due diligence and bring information specific to your organization to the plate so that we can have discussions and make decisions based on your organization's culture, infrastructure, and internal policies and processes. So to help guide our discussion, this is what we're going to focus on today: security and compliance. This comes up a lot during a deployment. Today we're going to focus on alignment and getting sign-off from key stakeholders. The second one we're going to look at is what we call application, business process, and integration. So what is that? Think, if you unplug your messaging infrastructure, what do you break? So we're going to identify some of these risks and discuss why, again, we want to branch those off from your typical end-user deployment timeline. The third area we're going to look at is around infrastructure integration, specifically focused on networking, authentication, and provisioning. So our assumption is that you have these processes and systems already in place. So we want to look at watch points and best practices around each of these areas. And then finally, we're going to talk about user adoption and change management. These are part of post-deployment go-live activities and also can be an indication of a successful deployment. So the bulk of our discussion today is going to be around technical considerations. So this is not just unique to enterprise-level organizations. This happens with all deployments. But typically, with large organizations, this is a more complex discussion that we have, and it's often more difficult to solution. So I'll let Shamus go ahead and kick it off with security and compliance.
Thank you, Keith. And thank everyone for coming today. Quick show of hands, who's in the middle of a G Suite deployment? Cool. Who's actually done a G Suite deployment? Okay, great. So security is a top priority, of course. G Suite security features and best practices are well documented. We're not going to walk you through the list of those today. As a large organization, your challenge is ensuring you're deploying G Suite while meeting your security requirements. Yes, G Suite has enterprise security features, but maybe there's simply some gaps with your requirements. Maybe you've already invested significantly in existing controls, and now you want to integrate these with G Suite. So, for example, your InfoSec team may want to use your existing DLP and integrate that with G Suite. And you find out that that's going to take 3 months and $200,000, and now you're looking at budget issues and potentially timeline issues. So the number one thing is to engage your InfoSec team as early as possible. Make them an integral part of the deployment team. The key here to success is to have alignment with your project team, InfoSec, and your stakeholders. So issues and risks can be documented and decisions can be made quickly and efficiently. To help you with this, we recommend executing a security control analysis. This is a plan that's going to include analysis of your requirements and your existing controls, the current corporate tools being used to implement those controls, and the G Suite considerations, the equivalent features and functionality. You want to ask, is there functionality in G Suite that meets our requirements for our existing security policies? Or if not, can G Suite be integrated into our existing controls to meet our requirements? The outcome of this should be a clear disposition of controls, where they will be implemented, and most importantly, where the gaps are that you need to prioritize. And maybe, hopefully, this will be an opportunity to deploy more security policies than you currently enforce. This exercise will expose those options for you. Now, here are some key areas that need to be evaluated. Email hygiene protection. So the key decision point is if you're going to use your existing email hygiene solution or switch and use Gmails. This decision will have major implications on mail routing design, which is a huge success factor for a G Suite deployment. It's something that needs to go right. So if you're deciding to integrate Gmail into your existing mail routing, or either way, lock yourselves in a room, figure out your mail routing as early as possible in your deployment. DLP, information rights management, the key here is to understand G Suite's capabilities in these areas and make sure that they meet your current needs or future needs as well. Get a dev environment, get your hands dirty, test these out. There's tons of documentation out there, but you really need to go in and understand how to use these, how they work, so you know exactly what you're getting. If you have an existing DLP or IRM system, understand if Gmail can integrate with that, and if so, what is exactly supported. Regulatory compliance. So these typically come up very often. It's a big concern. The associated risks with this should be closed prior to the project kickoff. But a common issue we see is that something gets missed and it doesn't come up until later into the deployment. The example would be, let's say you're kicking off a project, you've invited business stakeholders from, pick a European country, and they start bringing up all the requirements and their concerns with moving to G Suite, and now you have issues. So get those solved earlier, get those out of the way so you can move forward with your deployment. Legal requirements, so the task here is to identify your email retention requirements, legal holds, and e-discovery needs, and implementing them before migrating data or putting users on the platform to make sure that you're still going to be in compliance. Also engage your legal team so they can update their operational procedures for the new system and processes. You may have an archiving platform already. Assuming that you're going to use Google Vault, you'll need to consider what to do with that data. Again, the goal here with all of these is to be aligned with InfoSec so everyone can agree on the impacts and the plan and move forward with your deployment. Now let's take a look at some other things that may be new or inherent to moving to G Suite. And I'll have Keith talk about those.
All right, so sharing. So one of the functions and features around Google that's very powerful is their sharing and collaboration platform. So you want to understand how sharing, specifically external sharing, may impact your users. You want to have a good understanding of the options and functions within G Suite as it relates to sharing so you can establish a policy that aligns with your current security posture but keeps your users productive. Once you have this policy, you want to communicate that to your users as well as provide them some guidance around sharing usability. For example, if you decide to restrict external sharing for some or all of your users, you probably want to develop a process where they can request an exception to that policy. You also may want to think about things such as alternative options for them to either share or collaborate with external vendors or partners. There's also a few security features within G Suite that will help you protect your data once it's stored in Drive. And some of these we've already talked about, right? So DLP helps you protect from data leakage. Information rights management helps protect yourself from unauthorized access of files within Drive. Auditing. So there's audit logs that captures all of the different changes to files that are in Drive. We recommend that your security team periodically reviews these files looking for data overexposure based on sharing. And then finally, alerting. We recommend that you proactively set up alerts that's triggered by sharing changes to any files that may contain sensitive data. Managing access to third-party apps. So once your users are on the G Suite platform, they're going to have access to the Google Chrome Web Store as well as G Suite Marketplace. So these places host a lot of applications that can access your users' data. So this could be a gift and a curse, right? So it gives your users a great user experience, but from a security perspective, it can cause you some concerns and headaches. So let's look at some ways we can manage the way that these third-party applications accesses your users' data. So these applications access your users' data leveraging Google's APIs and using the OAuth authentication protocol. So within the admin console, you have a couple of options of how you manage that, right? So one is to disable what we call high-risk APIs for all users unless you've identified them as a trusted app, right? So this gives the users the freedom to download and install any app that's considered low risk. So for example, one could download the ESPN Chrome app and watch their bracket bust on the first week of NCAA March Madness. Not telling on myself, but. The second option is to basically disable access to all apps unless you've identified them as trusted. This is a more aggressive approach, but what it does is it allows you can, well, actually, what you want to do if you're doing that option is you want to also develop a process where users can request access to additional apps. And by doing so, you allow your security teams to run any type of security assessment or penetration testing before you make those generally available to your users. Now, we talked about the ability to monitor via logs. You can do that as well here. So you have OAuth logs, and so your security teams can, again, periodically review those, looking for dangerous or suspicious apps, and revoke that access if needed. You can also educate your users. They have the ability to actually perform a self-security assessment and look at what apps have access to their data. And then they can take action to revoke that access if they choose to. So at the end of the day, what you want to do is you want to determine what's your approach to managing access of these applications. Do you want to be more proactive or do you want to be more reactive? Operations. So from an operations perspective, you want to identify your team members and understand what their roles and responsibilities will be. That way, when you assign administrative privileges, you're going to follow the principle of least privilege and only assign them the minimal administrative privilege that they need to perform their job. At that point, you can also identify training needs and understand what administrative training that they may need within G Suite. You also want to make sure they understand the tools that are available to them to support G Suite and how those tools relate to any existing processes and tools that they already have today. So for example, there's what we call the G Suite Security Toolbox, which allows you to identify, triage, and remediate security incidents, such as a compromised mailbox. You want to make sure your teams understand how to use those tools and when to use those in conjunction with your already well-established processes. So what we typically see is sometimes these discussions actually fall by the wayside as you focus on end-user migration activities. So you want to make sure you have these discussions early on in the deployment process so they feel comfortable with supporting your users upon go live. So mobility. So we've seen a lot of changes in this space when it comes to G Suite. And you may be aware G Suite does have an MDM solution that comes with G Suite, and it's included in your licenses. So this may be appealing from a cost perspective. However, you want to do your due diligence and understand the capabilities of this solution to make sure it's the right solution for you. You want to familiarize yourself with all the capabilities and functions around managing mobile devices. So there's a lot of information out there regarding support articles and knowledge-based articles around these functions, but we recommend that you work with your partner and create and use test use cases specific to your organization. That way you can understand the actual user experience when they enroll their devices, and you also understand the different policies that apply to iOS versus Android. So some things that may help you here is understanding the device types your organization has. Hopefully it's no BlackBerries. Understanding what your mobility strategy is, right? BYOD, CYOD, COPE, corporate owned. What are your existing MDM security requirements and any future requirements? Will I have the same policy applied to all users and all devices, or different policies to a different set of users and different devices? Do you have an existing China access policy, or is this something that you need to develop? So again, you want to make sure that the solution checks all of your required boxes when you make a decision of which MDM solution to use.
Thank you. Okay, the next section here, application and third-party integrations. The reason that this is a major topic today is it's often overlooked in the early stages of the deployment. with the potential for some pretty big risks, namely business disruption if something breaks. So again, the way that we like to frame this is, imagine if you're ripping the plug on your email infrastructure. Daunting thought, right? But what's going to break, besides people complaining that they're not getting email, are your applications that are integrated with your email infrastructure. Some example types of these would be SMTP, so applications, relaying through, for example, maybe your Exchange environment, IMAP and POP, applications, processing email in some fashion, even deeper integration, from an Exchange perspective with EWS and MAPI. Also in this category would be dependencies on email clients like Outlook plugins, connectors, Salesforce plugins, telephony, things like that. So your first task is to take inventory, of course. Document the type of integration, prioritize the solution. You'll know your heavy hitters here. You'll know your biggest risks. So you can manage these tasks and properly get these implemented without breaking anything. What about ones with really high complexity? And honestly, these could, we've seen these take months to do. Maybe it's a code rewrite. Maybe it's a new application. That's why it's important, and Keith talked about this earlier, is to decouple this application integration work stream from your end user deployment. We can configure mechanisms with Gmail and using routing controls to ensure that these keep working and give you time to implement these properly and minimize the risk. And make sure you're keeping on with your end user deployment timeline. Again, documenting and understanding the impacts here so you can manage these appropriately is the key. Shared mailboxes, oh boy. This is my favorite topic. I finally get to tell the world about shared mailboxes. This is something that probably doesn't come up that often if you've been talking about G Suite and deployments. And even if it does get talked about, it tends to get swept under the rug, and then you have issues at the end of the deployment with them, and it's just no fun. So part of the reason is these may not come up in your pre-sales discussions. From a standpoint of number of licenses, how many user mailboxes do you have? Oh, we have 20,000 end user accounts. So they're using that to scope or to estimate your licensing costs, and also for a statement of work if you're going through a deployment. So you can see this could be a budget issue where you haven't scoped that additional work. That's going to come later. Also, you may need to purchase additional G Suite licenses for these shared mailboxes. We've seen organizations with shared mailboxes into the many thousands, so it's important to be aware of potential cost implications here. Step one is simply getting an estimation on the number of these that you have. So now that you know you have shared mailboxes, where do you go from here? There's a detailed methodology that we have and that we would take you through in a deployment. But the main aspects you need to consider in the planning stages are taking inventory, what do you have, what needs to go into G Suite, who needs access to those, provisioning, how you're going to provision these in G Suite. That's a whole other topic. There's a couple different ways to do it. But it's really important that you understand the pros and cons for those. End user access, how you're going to manage taking away users access to shared mailboxes. End user training and support, they're going to be accessing these in Gmail now or maybe Google Groups. So preparing the documentation, the communications, and the support for day one is key. And administration from your team, onboarding, offboarding these shared mailboxes. All that stuff needs to... The other risk is you need to start planning these early to avoid delaying the migration of these. So the biggest thing we see is we deploy our end users, but now we have all these shared mailboxes. They're not ready to go. So now we're extending the project, 1, 2, 3 months trying to get all these in and do all this work around them. So starting these early, your goal is going to be to cut these over with your users on day one. May seem like a lot of work, but it's going to save you a lot of pain and a lot of trouble. If you don't, you're going to be extending that deployment timeline and costs. So the takeaway here, by knowing you have these, understanding the potential for budget and timeline risks, you're already on your way to a properly managed transition. What you don't want is this to come up as a surprise and scramble to get these in place.
Okay. Infrastructure integration, again, we're going to talk about networking, authentication, and provisioning. Our assumption, again, is that you already have these strategies or these processes in place. And it's important to understand how these work within your organization and how these moving pieces fit together, because we want to minimize disruption as we deploy G Suite. So we're going to focus on these 3 topics, and there's other topics that are part of, quote, infrastructure integration, and we've already touched on some of these today, right? So we've talked about mobility, security, application integration, and administration. So from networking, so when we go into a deployment, a lot of times there's a myth that you have to make major changes to your network. Typically, this is not so, right? Large organizations already have some type of SaaS application or applications that they're using, so the whole concept of accessing an application in the cloud is not a new one. So you typically find there. The other concern, or typically the other top concern, is how much additional bandwidth am I going to utilize by using this application in the cloud? Right? So there's no quick, dirty math that we can do when we come into the front door and say it's going to go up by X percentage. Right? So what we want to do is we want to identify some best practices and some things to avoid, so that when you do your network discovery, you understand how network ready you are. Right? So. Identify. You want to identify any locations that may already have high bandwidth utilizations or have slow access to the internet. Simplify. Decentralize your network. Get your traffic onto Google's traffic as soon as possible by leveraging local egress points. Localize. Use local DNS servers so that so that Google can geolocate your users and route their traffic to the closest Google data center. Snapshot. So take a snapshot of your existing bandwidth utilization as it is today, before you even start the deployment process. Then take additional snapshots after each deployment phase. That way you can understand the network impact that you're making as you're moving users to the G Suite platform. And then plan. Develop a plan for China access. And also develop a plan to mitigate any issues that you may have discovered during your network discovery process. A few things to avoid: filtering. So you don't want to use things like proxies or web content filtering solutions to send your Google traffic through. Whitelisting. Avoid using fully qualified domain names or IP to whitelist Google traffic in things such as firewalls. Prioritizing. Don't try to prioritize different traffic within the G Suite services. So don't try to prioritize mail over calendar. And then finally, synchronization. So you want to use some caution if you're going to deploy things that synchronize large amounts of data, such as like fat email clients. Right? You want to understand what impact that may have to your network, if any. If you're doing data migrations, you may have to make special considerations or configuration changes for that if you're leveraging your local network. So authentication. So we like to use what we call the use what you have strategy. Right? We don't want to go in and add another authentication method and provide users with another set of credentials if they don't need it. Right? So we recommend leveraging an SSO solution for authentication, and we hope you have it. Right? That makes our job easier. So if you do have SSO, there's some certain things that you want to understand within the actual G Suite console when you go to enable that. All right? So one is you can only point it to a single identity provider. So all of your users need to be within that SSO solution and be able to authenticate against it. So that may come into play if you're a company that does a lot of acquisitions. When you enable it within Google, it uses what we call the Big Bang approach. So it's usually either all or nothing. There's some exceptions, but it's really IP-based. So you can't really deploy SSO for a limited number of users and slowly roll that out. If you need to do any type of SSO testing, we recommend using a test domain for that. And then finally, remember your super admins can always bypass SSO in the event your solution goes down, and they need to go in there and disable it for your users. So if you don't have an SSO solution, again, we recommend that you do invest in one. And if you're going to implement an SSO solution, we recommend that you decouple that from your G Suite migration, right? So we've seen issues where people try to deploy both at the same time. SSO solution is not ready, and all of a sudden you usually get a bad perception around G Suite, right? G Suite is not available, and it's not a G Suite issue, but it's more of an SSO solution. So some considerations that you want to think about if you're thinking about actually deploying a new SSO solution: do your load testing. You want to make sure all of your users can authenticate to G Suite through your SSO solution and any other application. We've seen issues where everything looked fine for core IT and core IT and early adopters, and then global go live, all of a sudden SSO is not available. So we're not speaking from experience, but we've heard it's a very, very, very bad thing. All right. The second thing you want to do is high availability. You want to make sure that the solution is always available. Not typically an issue today because most SSO solutions are at least partly in the SaaS, if not 100% SaaS. Again, not something that we've been through, but we've had to deal with 100% on-prem solutions that were not available for go live. And the last thing you want to do is latency test. So you want to make sure that all of your users have the same or similar experience when authenticating through your SSO solution, regardless of where they're at. All right, so provisioning. So from a domain perspective, you want to take inventory of all of your domains, but then you want to make sure you identify only the ones that have to do with mail routing. Right? This is typically not a lift and shift of all of the domains that you currently manage. From a user perspective, you probably already have a process where you provision your users. So you want to understand how that relates to G Suite. Do we simply just put that as a downstream application and your users get provisioned? Many of our clients actually synchronize their user objects from a directory service. If you're doing something like that, it's Google's recommendation that all of those users are in what we call a single source of truth. Right? So if you have objects that are stored in different directories, you either want to think about consolidating those or investing in some third-party applications that will allow you to sync objects from multiple directories. So distribution lists. So probably within your organization today, you probably have a process where groups, different types of groups, are created for different purposes. Right? You may have some completely security groups, and then others that are used for mailing lists. So within G Suite, you want to understand that those groups, there's really a one concept of a group, but that group can be used in different ways, right? So you may have a group that's been created, and it can be used as a distribution list or a mailing list. That same group can be used to provide access to Drive and files in Drive. You can also share counters with those groups. So you want to make sure that you understand that and realize how that applies differently within G Suite. Management. So there is a function within G Suite that allows you to have your end users create and manage a group, specifically the settings and the membership of that group. So on the surface, it sounds like a good idea because you're pushing that functionality away from IT onto your end users. You want to use some caution if you're thinking about this because that can turn into what we call the wild, wild west of group creation. And as we talk about group usage, if you're using these groups to provide access to, say, resources in GCP, or projects in GCP, you probably don't want a standard end user managing those membership lists. Timing. So when you're provisioning your groups, you want to make sure that they're fully provisioned in Google before you direct any internet inbound mail, okay? Again, we're not speaking from experience, but we've seen issues where mail is already flowing to G Suite and then people try to provision their groups. And what ends up happening is the mail is not consistently delivered to all the members because they're still populating as mail is being delivered to those groups. So operations. So operations, you want to look at onboarding and offboarding and how that integrates with your current onboarding and offboarding workflows. So a couple things that we've seen here. A lot of applications, when they deprovision a user, actually suspends it and it doesn't delete the user. So what ends up happening is you have a lot of suspended users that are consuming your licenses, right? So you want to come up with a process, either automated or manual, where you review these suspended accounts and then delete them to recover those licenses. Now, before you actually delete them, there's a couple things that you want to be aware of. So one, you want to make sure that you meet any policies that you have to maintain accounts and their data for a specific amount of time. The second thing you want to understand is that you do have the ability to transfer some data to other accounts prior to deleting them. So you want to work that into your workflow. And then the third thing, if you're utilizing Google Vault, today, if you delete a user account from G Suite, it also deletes the data from G Suite as well as Vault, even if that user is on legal hold. So in summary, you want to identify your mail routing domains, understand end-to-end provisioning from a user perspective, understand when to provision groups and who's going to manage them, and also have a process to recover licenses for suspended users.
Okay, so we tried to identify areas that tend to get pushed to the back of the line in deployments. Within nearly all the areas we talked about today, there are some common themes. Starting early, involving the right people, getting alignment. But there's so much more to talk about. Keith and I have been doing this for a long, long time. We love the G Suite community. Come find us if you want to talk shop. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our training and change management expert, Emeline.
All right, thanks everyone. So you're all probably here to understand how to make your G Suite deployment a success from a technical perspective. But indulge me in a few moments as we talk about how to make it a success from a people perspective. And also, it would be weird if you all just got up and left right now. So you can spend a lot of time and money to ensure that the technical deployment of G Suite goes without any issues for your organization. But a perfectly migrated mailbox and calendar does not equal a successful G Suite migration. You really need to focus on how that is going to affect your people, right? So organizations tend to focus a lot on the technical aspects of the project, but you will fail if you do not plan or put a plan into place that's going to support your users through this change. So a properly thought out, a well-planned and executed change management approach is the key to success of your G Suite migration and adoption of the toolset. All right, so we usually kick off our deployments with this phrase: change is not an event, it's a process. To be successful, you need to plan for the change before and long after the deployment of G Suite within your organization. But we so often lose sight of this as we shift our focus to tactically preparing for the main event, the cutover, the G Suite go live. But you have to remember that for your users, Go Live Day, that is just the beginning of their adoption of G Suite. That is just the very, very beginning of figuring out what the heck is going on in this new world of messaging. And so much more is available in G Suite than just messaging, as we know. So let's talk about what else we should be doing throughout the process of migrating to G Suite. I'm gonna wrap up today's conversation by talking about what you should be focusing on before, during, and after your deployment on the people side of things. So planning your change the right way probably starts way before you even select your technology, much less the partner that's going to help you through the process. You need to start by understanding your people, the people that make up your organization. And I don't just mean headcounts in the various countries that are a part of your company. What I mean is who are your people and how is this going to affect them? So you choose G Suite. Maybe before that you set a goal. What do you want for your organization? What do you see as the future? So maybe that goal is transforming the way that your people work together, the way that your company becomes more digital and a more agile organization. You have to understand that a technology change is not enough. That is just the beginning of that type of huge cultural shift within your company. So remember, and you've probably heard this before, and it's probably a little corny in this day and age, but organizations don't change. People change, right? So you need to spend the time up front completing your stakeholder analysis, understanding who your people are and how you can start to organize them together into user groups, and then really documenting the change impacts and how they will affect each of those user groups or those personas. Ask yourself these questions. Who makes up your organization? How can we group those users together into personas so that you can start building a change plan around their needs? How will this change affect each of these employees? And how will this change affect overall your different user groups that make up your company? Right? And what measures do you need to put in place at the end of the day to make sure that all of your employees are supported through this change over to G Suite? A true understanding of your organization and the makeup of your organization is really important, and we sometimes forget to spend enough focus on that. It will help you inform your change planning across your communications and engagement activities, your training offerings, and your sponsorship activities. And it'll help you make the right decision for your people. All right, so during the deployment, now that you've spent the time and the resources on really understanding your organization and the impacts that are going to come with this major change over to G Suite, you can really deploy now in a very strategic way to meet the needs of your different types of users. You've put in the legwork, you understand who your people are. Let's plan towards making this successful in a strategic way for each of our different user groups. You're able to map out what the user journey looks like for each of your personas that you're deploying to, and really understand how they're going to go through this journey, at what time we might need to have special considerations for them. Are there special training offerings? Are there previews for our executive assistants that are going to make them more comfortable with this change overall? Are there considerations we need to make from a communications or training perspective for our highly mobile workers? So if you break out your company into user groups, you can really start to map out those user journeys and understand how they'll go through that process, because we're not all the same, right? We all have different needs. You can develop training that meets the specific needs of each group as well, so that you can really train on the moments that matter for those groups. Everyone's got different pieces they want to focus on day one, after 6 months, after a year. Everyone has different needs. All right, and finally, post-deployment. So by now you've spent the last few months really understanding your people and the personas that make up your organization, and you've planned a deployment that's been tailored specifically for them. So because of that, you've got the insight that you need for each of these groups so that you understand the impact for them of moving to G Suite, and you understand also the appetite for change that each of these groups have. You're now better equipped to set realistic adoption metrics that can be measured long term. Don't set yourself up for failure. If you really know your people and their processes and their needs, you know that it's unlikely that we're going to achieve 100% adoption right away, or sometimes maybe even ever. So Go Live is just the beginning of the journey to adoption of G Suite for your users. Make sure that your change planning includes communications and a training approach for your users post Go Live so that you can drive adoption with realistic goals in mind.